Atheism 101 presents Noah's Flood and Exodus, and how they are mutually exclusive events. Mutually exclusive events means that if one of them happened, the other one couldn't have. The idea I'm using here is fairly simple. Let's consider the following dates as reasonably reliable. They are derived from a Google search and are consistent with the estimates placed on the dates by biblical creationists. So if we look first at Noah's flood, 2348 BC is consistent with their analysis of Genesis. If we want to date the Exodus, it's a bit more difficult. The 1446 BCE is considered to be an early estimate. A later estimate would be 1290 BC, and I found this on a creationist website. So this one is dated at 1290 BC. BC and BCE really mean the same thing. So let's look at a timeline. So we have current era up here and BCE down here. So the flood is supposed to have been here. The early date for Exodus was here. The later date we saw for Exodus was here. And I'm making this video in 2017. So at this point here, the world population would have been 8 people, the survivors of the flood. And for the purposes of this particular video, I'm going to assume that the population could have been propagated from those 8 people. 8 people does not constitute what's known as a minimum viable population. In other words, it's impossible that everybody on Earth now could have come from those 8 people, but let's ignore that for the moment. Today, there are about 7.4 billion people on Earth. Now assume that the population has grown at a constant rate, and by that I mean by a constant percentage each year. If you think of a similar concept, it would be something like compound interest. The number of people living at the end of each year should then be approximately a geometric series. Now I should point out here, and I've drawn this from Wikipedia, that I'm actually doing creationists a favour by making this assumption. We can see here that rapid growth has happened since the 18th century. So by doing this and assuming constant growth from the flood to me making this video, I'm actually assuming a rate that's higher than it would have been down here in these early years. Rapid expansions only really happened in recent times. Now let's give a brief explanation of how this would work. So if we start with those 8 people and we have a constant percentage rate of increase, then 8 are after 1 year. Now I realise that that's silly because we're not going to have point something of a person, but this would statistically work out over a long period of time. And then the next one would be 8r squared after the following year, and so on. Now we're talking about going from 2348 BC up to 2017. Now, just as a quick calculation, that is 4,364 years. So 8r to the 4,300, and it should be 63 years, but 1 year doesn't make a difference. So let's just say that that is the current world population. So 8r to the 4364 is equal to 7400,000,000. We can solve that using logarithms or a computer algebra system, and we find that r is 1.004742, and that's about a 0.47% rise each year. So let's go back to our timeline and apply this for the time between Noah's flood and Exodus. If we use the early time, then we're talking 2348, which is when the flood happened. Take away 1446, add 1, gives us 903 years between the two events. If I do 8 multiplied by 1.004742 to the power 902, which is the n-1 thing I was talking about up here. It doesn't really matter if you're just a year or two either side, and we'll see that in a moment. If we do that, that comes to approximately 571 people. So the world population would have been 571 people at the time of Exodus. We'll come back to that in a moment. Let's just do the late date. So 2348, take away 1290, add 1, gives us 1059 years. If we do 8 multiplied by 1.004742 to the power 1059, that is approximately 1199 people. So even at the late date, the entire world population would have been less than 1,200 people. Now, as a quick calculation, I also looked at what would happen if it was 500 years later than this date, and the world population would have been around 6,075 people. And remember, this model is actually doing creationists a favour. I'm overestimating the growth of the population because statistics from actual archaeologists have shown that the population did not grow this rapidly in those early days. The estimates from actual archaeologists show that there were probably between 14 million and 27 million people at the time of the supposed Exodus. So there's much more chance of the Exodus actually having happened if we just exclude Noah's flood. With Noah's flood, Exodus couldn't possibly have happened. So, let's have a look at a world map. Now, we know that there's a record of continuous occupation of Mesopotamia, or this region here. It was the Mesopotamian civilization from about 3700 BCE. And again, subject for a later video, let's ignore the fact that they don't seem to be at all inconvenienced by the fact that they all died in this massive flood during the course of their civilization. Egypt has been going from about 3300 BCE. These are actually big civilizations. Indus Valley, 2300 BCE. North China, 2200 BCE. And Southeast Asia from about 1500 BCE. So lots and lots of people lived in these regions, either before the flood, immediately after the flood, and at the time of Exodus. There are also civilizations that we know of over here, around the time of Exodus, and over here not long after. And then these other regions that I've done in blue are places that we know people were living around those times. They weren't big civilizations, we don't have written records, but we have archaeological evidence that people lived there. And I'm sure that's true in many other places of the world where I haven't put blue dots. However, According to Exodus, we have 600,000 men on foot, 603,550. How they come up with such a ridiculously accurate number is beyond me. They must have spent all their time doing a census rather than actually running away from Egypt. However, these are men aged 20 and up. By the time you add on the women and the children, we're probably talking close to 2 million people. Where on earth did they all come from? They must have been running away from a population of millions, and you've got millions of people living all over the world at this time. And yet, if Noah's flood happened, there could not possibly have been anywhere near that number of people living in the world. Hence we arrive at the title of this video. If Noah's flood had actually happened, there couldn't possibly have been enough people in the world for Exodus to have happened. And then, conversely, if Exodus happened, the world population couldn't have been reduced to 8 people such a short time beforehand. All of these stories, like Noah's flood and Exodus, and I'll be doing a lot more videos on these types of events, they're just stories that people told themselves in the Bronze Age around campfires, willing suspension of disbelief, just like watching Spider-Man or Iron Man at the movies. People who actually believe these stories today are delusional. Just do the math, do the science, do the archaeology.